Thank you for having me here, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of the history of Finos and hopefully to share with you why we are reaching what we hope is an organic equilibrium, a Nash equilibrium in financial services and the fintech technology strategy. I'm Gabriele Columbro. I'm the executive director of Finos, the Fintech Open Source Foundation. We are the foundation for open source in financial services under the Linux Foundation. As you can see, I'm very proud of this slide. We have a very diverse community of almost 50 members across financial institutions, both investment and retail banks, financial technology vendors, and increasingly open source vendors, and more generally, tech services and technology and product companies that are realizing the huge opportunity that there is in an industry that has been, historically not so fond of open source. I'm sure you guys in the audience can probably relate to the fact that open source in financial services has been an oxymoron for many years. The reality is not only we've almost reached 50 members in Finos, and of course, these are all members of the Linux Foundation as well, but we have over 50 between our software and standard projects, as well as our special interest groups. This has been an outstanding growth. If we just look at last year, the comparison with last year, we have almost doubled the number of contributors. We have about 1,000 contributors now that have been historically active in the foundation. We've reached, as I said, over 50 projects, almost 50 members. And of course, we're growing in the team as well to support this fantastic momentum that we're seeing, not only in Finos, but more broadly, what I would call, we're entering the golden age of open source in financial services. But as I said, it hasn't always been the case. So I want to take you down a little bit down a trip down memory lane. We don't have to go back that far. This article is from 8 years ago. And really, that was the sentiment, more generally, in financial services about open source, ranging from we don't use open source to we hate open source to, open source is a huge risk. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this a big story from Goldman Sachs about 10 years ago, where there was an actual lawsuit filed for a high-frequency trader, an ex-employee that allegedly uploaded high-frequency trading code to the cloud, or to a subversion repository, while, again, the defense was really that most of that code was actually open source code. And that has created this perception that, in addition to an industry that is very much risk averse, that is much sort of culturally highly competitive, that open source was too big of a risk to use and certainly to actually contribute to. But then at a certain point, somewhere in the last 5 to 8 years, the perception started to change. Take a look at this example. Not sure how many of you are familiar with SecDB, the securities database that is really used throughout Goldman Sachs. And in this article from 2013 was widely regarded as their secret sauce. It's what differentiated them from other financial institutions. Fast forward only 4 years, same publication, the very same piece of software, SecDB, was started to be perceived as a potential weakness, as a potential liability. And why is that? Well, SecDB is a fully proprietary framework. It's something that, a firm will struggle to find talent out there to continue developing, to maintain, to really keep on par with platforms from their competitors. If you look at other financial institutions, that potentially based their platforms on, Python, for example, well, That gave a massive access to talent that is out there. Not only so, but the community has continued developing a huge ecosystem of plugins, extensions, especially on the machine learning, data science side of the house, which are fundamental to running an investment banking business. And so it's very interesting to me to see how the perception around proprietary versus open source has started changing, not only in the eye of technologists that of course are fond of open source, but most importantly, in the eye of the business. And so around 5 to 8 years ago, we have seen the industry starting dipping their toes, not only in consuming open source. I mean, I've heard for the longest time, no, we don't use open source, or no, our developers are not allowed to use open source. Well, the reality, as we probably all know, is that developers find a way. And typically, if they use open source without a regulatory compliance, consumption framework, well, then you run a much bigger risk, as we are seeing through the massive rise of supply chain attacks that we're seeing nowadays. But as I said, the industry started working into contributing open source. AMQP, originally open sourced by JP Morgan with the help of Red Hat. OpenMama, which is now under Finos, proudly, I would say, under Finos, but it got open source years ago under the Linux Foundation. Not all these efforts were successful. On top right, you see an article referencing Lodestone. There was a foundation promoted by Deutsche Bank with HSBC and other players that unfortunately wasn't set up for success, but there was the first glimpse of investment banks understanding that working on a shared IB infrastructure would be beneficial and also provide a way to balancing against a lot of the incumbent vendors that exist in the industry. And last but not least, I can certainly testify to the Symphony Software Foundation, which is actually the predecessor of Finos. I got called to run that foundation in late 2015. This was an attempt by 12 financial institutions to create an open source a connective tissue chat and collaboration platform that would enable modern API-based end-to-end encrypted collaboration on a cross-firm across the firewall in a very highly regulated and compliant industry. So it's really in the last few years that we're seeing this industry dipping the toes in open source until 2018, where we thought the timing was absolutely ripe for an industry-wide effort. And that's where we launched Finos, let alone it's not a platform, it's a foundation. But the reality is the trust that we were able to build amongst these financial institutions paired with the seismic shifts that were happening in the industry and the desire for the industry to become much more technology focused created a very fertile environment to run and create and launch Finos, the Fintech Open Source Foundation, a foundation that was solely dedicated to foster open source in financial services. I'm not going to go through the whole history of Finos, but there are a couple of milestones that I want to share with you because I think they're functional to understand where we are right now. When we launched in 2018, most of our commits and contributions were coming from vendors. This is unsurprising. Vendors have a much bigger familiarity with open source, and especially open source contribution, than financial institutions. And so our focus was really about enabling financial institutions through our open source readiness project to actually be able to contribute to open source. I mean, you probably know, and it's probably the case in some institutions still today, developers might not even be able to access GitHub. But something started to change in 2019. We've seen JP Morgan open sourcing a major library called Perspective. And then 2020, I would like to take full credit for it, but the reality is the pandemic gave what we call a digital acceleration to the industry. And that's what we've seen firms of the likes of Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Citi, Deutsche Bank, historically very conservative firms, open sourcing massive amounts of code, years and years of intellectual property that are now available under Finos, and they are being built upon. Cross-pollination is happening nowadays, especially in 2021. This was frankly unprecedented because, you know, consumption, the value of consumption of open source for an industry that is very ROI driven, well, you know, sometimes it's hard to identify the ROI in consumption. But it's, you know, in a way easier than justifying the ROI of contribution. Take, for example, one of the Finos Platinum members who has, you know, looked at the value of consuming perspective, again, originally contributed by JP Morgan, and put it in a ballpark of over $3 million in basically headcounts and time savings. Well, that is pretty clear. But when I look at our leaderboard today, and by the way, this is powered by the amazing LFX platform from the Linux Foundation. So check it out, lfx.linuxfoundation.org. I am really proud to see that 8 of our top 10 contributors are actually individuals from financial institutions. This is, I would say, frankly, unprecedented. We've never seen individuals from financial institutions being able to, being incentivized to, and ultimately taking the leap to become leaders in open source projects and honestly running an open source community in a largely organically growing and self-sustained fashion. Let me give you a couple of examples here just to put it in context so that we can really understand what's going on here. Last year, Goldman Sachs decided to open source their logical data modeling platform called Legend. Some of you might be familiar with it as Alloy. That was the former internal name. This made a major splash in the industry, not only because this is now developed in an open source first way. If you go to github.com/finos.legend, you'll see that the development happens in the open. Releases are published on Docker and on Maven Central. This is not a dump and run. From a technology standpoint, this is by all means how an open source project should be run. And again, this is pretty unprecedented. But as of this year, we have seen other financial institutions starting not only to consume the code, but to contribute to the code. And even further, we are hosting a Legend instance in Finos. If you go to finos.org/legend, you can get access to it. And we're seeing firms taking the leap, sending their business folks, their data modelers, to collaborate on the platform to come up with industry-wide models that are actually hopefully going to be used by financial institutions, buy-side and wealth management, and we hope at a certain point regulators. So as you can see, this is moving past just a merely technical conversation. The industry is strategically realizing the business value of open source. But there are other examples. I'm sure you've all been in a trading floor at a certain point, and you're familiar with this massive multi-desktop, multi-screen, 50+ applications running. And so you can understand the value of a standard like FDC3 that stands for Financial Desktop Collaboration and Connectivity Consortium. This is one of the first projects, standard projects that Finos hosted. It was originally contributed by a vendor, OpenFin, but since then, we have seen massive adoption and even contribution from banks. Banks and institutions are defining the use cases of the standard, are telling us why and how a certain feature should be added based on their real life usage of the standard. This is not, once again, just slapping some logos out there. And to be clear, you know how hard it is to get some of those logos to be actually referenceable, especially in the context of an open source project. So this is real. We are having not only consumption, but outstanding contributions, both in terms of code and use cases from our financial institutions. But so why is that? Why are we seeing this contribution? I want to spend 1 minute on this. Earlier this year, we've announced in partnership with the Linux Foundation and our beloved members, Wipro, GitHub, and ScottLogic, our first State of Open Source in Financial Services survey. We are about to publish a report and a white paper on this at our upcoming Open Source Strategy Forum conference in London. I'm not going to give out too much detail here, just not to spoil the announcement, but there are two key points that I want to make here in terms of why we're seeing this increase in contributions. From a corporate standpoint, efficiency, whether it is cost savings or time efficiency, as well as shared innovation, are absolutely the top economic corporate motivators for these firms taking the leap into open source contribution. But as we all know, communities are made of individuals. And so individual respondents, they still feel that, we all grow up in open source communities, that value of learning to code, it's fun, solving problems, across the firewall. So we think that really open source here and open source contribution is, for the first time, able to marry the individual motivators with the corporate motivators. And this creates, once again, a very fertile environment to continue seeing these contributions happening. But I want to bring it one step forward. I'm assuming you guys are way more familiar than I am, not a mathematician, with John Nash, the famous American mathematician. And if you were expecting to see Russell Crowe here from A Beautiful Mind, I'm sorry, I decided to go for the actual John Nash, rest in peace. But a Nash Equilibrium, if you are not familiar with it, it's really the most common way to define a solution for a non-cooperative game where there are two or more players involved. And in this equilibrium, each player is assumed to know the strategies of the other players. And fundamentally, no player can increase their own payoff by changing the strategy unilaterally, by changing the strategies while the other players keep their strategies unchanged. And so how does this map to this situation, this time that we're living of open source contribution in financial services? Well, if you look at some definitions, if we define payoff, some of those motivators that we just discussed, cost saving, revenue, talent acquisition or retention, and if we define the strategy being consuming and contributing to shared, non-differentiated intellectual property, which is exactly what we're seeing happening right now in our community, well, how is this actually possible? Well, first of all, each player is assumed to know the strategies of the other players. And we think that a foundation like ours creates a level playing field that to a certain extent, allows players to, collaborate, trusting each other that, again, there is consumption and contribution to these shared commons. And no player can increase their own payoff. Well, if the majority of players continues to contribute to these commons of non-differentiating IP, well, you can only lose by reverting to a proprietary at all cost strategy. But the reality is that what is enabling this is open source contributions. If all the parties, like a few years ago, were only using a consume strategy, well, there would be no incentive for others to continue contributing. That's why we're really hopeful that 2020 wasn't just a fluke. And we think that actually 2021, fingers crossed, has continued to prove this. A project got contributed every month to Finos. We've had 10 new projects and special interest groups announced in the foundation this year. So hopefully this is a trend and not just a one-off due to a once-in-a-lifetime happening like the pandemic. So what we're seeing is really that not only the technology organization is engaging for the reasons that we're probably all very familiar and the benefits that open source brings, but the reality is that the business is now understanding that they can respond better to client demands. They can interact with regulators better. They can even bring this to a strategic level whereby they're level the playing field with big techs that keep coming after the financial services industry. And so we think there's been a huge realization over the last 2 years that open source needs to be a strategic pillar of the technology strategy of the industry. So what's next for us? One major area is to bring the regulators into the fold. We've started last year our Open RegTech initiative. We think mutualizing regulatory implementation, mutualizing and creating standards for regulatory reporting, and hopefully, much earlier than when my grandkids grow up, we'd love to see regulators producing open source machine readable regulation. This is a huge undertaking. We'd love to have your help and your feedback on how we can make this happen, but we think that this is in fact going to help close the circle. And so what are our vision? What's our vision moving forward? Well, not only we are seeing the industry, leapfrogging into a tech company through cloud and open source readiness, through a newfound developer centricity. Not only we continue adding open source to enable better APIs and data standards, even working with existing consortia, but truly the business of open source, the value of open source for the business, whether it is on the regulatory implementation, whether it's a better customer-centric collaboration, whether it is a more harmonized engagement with the fintech world. Ultimately, all of this, we hope it will make our vision come true, which is to have open source as a strategic technology pillar for the financial system. In conclusion, a quick shameless plug. If you are in London in just over 10 days or in New York, just a month later, we'd love to see you back in person. Our Open Source Strategy Forum, produced by the amazing Linux Foundation event team, is coming back in person in a city near you, hopefully. And so I'd really love to talk to you and to get your feedback on how we can grow open source in financial services even faster. And with that, thank you so much for your time and for this opportunity. Have a great rest of the conference.